When my son called me a burden, I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't even raise an eyebrow. I simply nodded, stood up from the dinner table, and began clearing the plates like I hadn't just heard the sharpest blade of language pierce straight through the heart of a father. By the following Tuesday, I'd called my attorney. By Friday, the new paperwork was signed, and by the end of the month, the man who delivered our mail, who knew my name, asked about my knees, and offered to bring my garbage cans in during the winter, became the sole inheritor of everything I had ever built. But this isn't a story that starts with a lawyer's signature or a notary's stamp. It starts with something far simpler and far more painful. A quiet Thursday night, a plate of reheated roast chicken, and the moment a father realized he was no longer family, just furniture that breathed too loudly. But before we get to the best part of this story, make sure you subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling us what you would do if your own child, your flesh and blood, looked you in the eye and called you a burden. You won't believe what happened next. It had been a long day, and dinner had been one of those awkward affairs that stretched on too long in silence. I made chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans the same way I used to when Thomas was 10 years old and begged for seconds. Now he just picked at it like it had offended him. Julia barely touched hers. She was sipping on one of those tall, skinny detox drinks that smelled like wet lawn clippings. I asked how her day had gone. She didn't answer. I offered to do the dishes. No one said thank you, and that's when it came. "Dad," Thomas said, pushing his plate forward and folding his hands like he was chairing a board meeting, "Julia and I have been talking." The air in the room changed. Julia's eyes were on me before he even finished the sentence. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and sat down across from them, already knowing whatever they were about to say had been rehearsed. "You've been with us for 3 years now," he continued, "and while we're glad we could help during your retirement—" "Help?" I raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "We think it's time you start considering some other options." My chest tightened. "Other options?" "There's a senior community in Maple Heights." Julia chimed in, her voice like frosting that covers up a burnt cake. "Modern, clean, activities, social clubs. Thomas says it's even close to the bus line so you won't need to drive." I looked at my son. "You want me to move out?" He winced like he didn't want to be the one to say it out loud. "It's just Julia and I need space, and it's getting difficult having someone else here all the time." Difficult. I thought back to last week when I fixed the leaking sink, or when I mowed the lawn so they wouldn't have to pay a landscaping crew, or the groceries I bought, the electric bill I quietly covered last month, the home-cooked meals, the folded laundry, the holiday decorations I set up by myself while they scrolled through their phones. "We're not trying to be cruel," Julia added, crossing her legs, "but there's a reason why most people your age live independently or, in a setting that fits their lifestyle better." "My lifestyle," I repeated. "Thomas," I said, shifting my eyes to him, "do you think I'm a problem?" He looked away, then down, then finally back at me. "I think you're becoming a burden." There it was, a sentence I'd never imagined hearing, not even in my worst nightmares, not after decades of sacrifice, not after working triple shifts to get him through school, not after cashing out Maria's life insurance to cover the down payment on his first house, not after being the only man standing at his wedding when his best man got food poisoning and had to bail. A burden. That's what I was now. Not a father, not a grandfather, not even a housemate. Just an extra mouth, a schedule conflict, a line item on his monthly list of regrets. I stared at my half-eaten food, the potatoes now cold and cracked at the edges. I looked at my son and his wife and wondered how long they had been planning this, how many nights they had whispered about me in bed, how many phone calls they had made, emails they had sent, researching ways to get me out without looking like villains. They had settled on Retirement Village like it was some kind of reward. I stood up slowly. "Well," I said, my voice calm, almost too calm. "I appreciate the honesty." Thomas opened his mouth, probably to backpedal. I held up a hand. "No need to say more. You've said enough." I cleared the dishes, rinsed them in the sink, and left them neatly stacked. Old habits die hard. I walked down the hallway past the gallery of family photos I had personally framed. My eyes found the one of us in Yellowstone the summer after Maria passed. Thomas was smiling. I wasn't. I didn't know why at the time, but now I did. I was already becoming unnecessary. I stepped into the garage, flicked on the old overhead light, and knelt down in front of the storage cabinet. It creaked when I opened it. Behind the plastic bins of tangled Christmas lights and the rusted toolbox I hadn't used since the roof repair was a metal fireproof lockbox. I hadn't opened it in years. My knees cracked as I sat down on the concrete floor and pulled it into my lap. The key was still taped to the bottom. Inside, the original copy of my will sat where I had left it, next to Maria's recipe book and the old letters she wrote to me when we were dating. I picked up the will. At the bottom of the page was Thomas's name written in thick black ink. Sole heir, sole decision maker, sole everything. I felt the words crawl across my chest like insects. Maria's handwriting was on the envelope that had once held this document. She had written, "If our boy forgets who you are, remind him who he was." I closed the box slowly, stood and looked out at the quiet street through the garage window. That's when I saw Frank, the mailman. He was across the road, slipping envelopes into the Pearsons' mailbox. Same guy for the last 15 years. Always had a smile, always asked about Maria, always patted the dog, always remembered my name. Frank, the man who had stopped one winter to help me lift a bag of salt into the back of the truck when my hands gave out. Frank, who asked how my knees were holding up after the replacement surgery. Frank, who had delivered every medical bill, every holiday card, every condolence letter when Maria died. A man with no obligation to me, no family tie, no stake, just kindness. Quiet, consistent, unassuming kindness. A man who had never once made me feel like I was in the way. I watched him disappear around the corner, his satchel bouncing against his side, and something in me settled. I went back inside, past Thomas and Julia, who were still sitting in the living room, pretending not to notice I had left the room, and climbed the stairs to my bedroom. I closed the door behind me and made 2 calls, the first to my attorney, the second to the local assisted living community, not to check myself in, but to ask how long their waiting list was. Asking for my son, I said. He might need it sooner than he thinks. That night I didn't eat dinner. I poured a glass of whiskey, opened Maria's recipe book, and turned to the page where she'd written out my favorite, her molasses cookies. The ink was smudged from the time I'd spilled coffee on it. She had circled the word always and written beside it, always leave a little something sweet for the people who matter. I folded the will and slid it into a new envelope, along with a sticky note that said, "You mattered, Frank." Then I slipped the envelope into the safe in my closet right behind my wedding ring and the deed to the house, just in case. Before my son called me a burden, he called me Dad. Before the long silences, the tight smiles, the shift in his posture when I entered a room, he used to run to me in bare feet, arms outstretched, yelling, "Daddy," like I was the sun coming up. I used to think memories like that would be enough to hold us together through the worst of it. I was wrong. Memory doesn't pay the mortgage. It doesn't make you welcome. It doesn't keep you from becoming an embarrassment. The years that led me to that dinner table where he asked me to leave his house didn't start with disrespect. They started with sacrifice, quiet, slow, bleeding sacrifice that built their world brick by brick while quietly erasing mine. And for what? So he could sit across from me with perfect posture and say I was in the way? Let me tell you something. Before I became a burden, I was the backbone. I remember the first time Thomas asked for help. He had just lost his job at the consulting firm in Denver. Julia had been freelancing part-time, and the bills were already stacked in neat little piles on their dining table. Their first baby, the one they never ended up having, was still just a hopeful name in a notebook. Thomas called me, voice cracking, saying he didn't know how to tell Julia they couldn't afford to stay in their rental another month. "Dad, I hate to ask," he'd said, "but if there's anything you can spare." I wired him $4,200 the next day. I remember standing in line at the bank with my fingers shaking. That money was supposed to cover a roof repair I'd been putting off for 2 winters. The leak in the attic had started dripping directly onto Maria's old cedar chest. I patched it with a blue tarp and 2 cinder blocks. It held for a while. A month after that, Julia called. Not Thomas. Julia. She said they were trying to save face with her parents and needed to stage the house a bit better if they wanted to sell it. Staging? That meant new furniture? a better coffee table, silk curtains instead of blinds. Just a loan, she had said, we'll pay it back. She never mentioned it again, and neither did I. I should have. After Maria died, there was no one left to warn me, no one to ask if I was okay, if I was giving too much, if I'd left any of myself for myself. Maria would have said something. She would have pulled me aside, rubbed my shoulder in that way she did when she needed to break hard news gently and said, Dennis, you're not his retirement plan. But she wasn't there, and I didn't know how to stop giving. I didn't know how to say no to Thomas. He was my only child, the only piece of her I had left, so I kept giving. I co-signed their mortgage when the bank hesitated over Julia's credit score. I paid the closing costs. I bought them a stainless steel fridge and a new washer-dryer set when theirs broke 2 months in. I handed over my wedding ring to cover a security deposit on their second home after they outgrew the starter house I'd already sunk $30,000 into. I did all of it gladly, or at least I told myself I did, because that's what love is, right? Unconditional. The problem is unconditional love has a cost, and if you're not careful, it leaves you bankrupt in more ways than one. I remember the Christmas Julia's parents came to visit for the first time. They flew in from Connecticut, brought wine that cost more than my winter heating bill, and looked at me like I was a clumsy prop in the background of their daughter's new life. Catherine had smiled at me with her teeth, but not her eyes. So, you're Thomas's father, she'd said, like she'd been expecting someone else. Julia says you used to work in construction? General contracting, I'd replied. Owned my own company for 24 years. She blinked. How quaint. That night I offered to carve the turkey. Catherine suggested maybe Thomas do it since he went to college. I laughed. No one else did. The next day I noticed Thomas had moved all the family photos with me and them off the mantel. Julia claimed she was just redecorating. A few years after that, they invited me to move in, temporarily. Thomas had herniated a disc, and Julia was working full-time again. We need help, he had said, sounding just desperate enough that I couldn't refuse. I packed a suitcase and drove across town, telling myself it was temporary. 6 months at the most. That was 3.5 years ago. In that time, I cooked every dinner, changed the air filters, paid for the new water heater, took the dog to the vet when Julia forgot. I never complained, not once, even when Julia rolled her eyes every time I hummed in the kitchen, even when Thomas stopped calling me Dad and started calling me him when talking to her, even when they left me off the invitation list to their New Year's party and pretended it was an oversight. I took it all because I thought it was love. But love doesn't look at you like you're something that needs to be relocated. Love doesn't whisper behind closed doors and Google how to evict a parent when they think you're asleep. Love doesn't plan your exile in a brochure with a smiling nurse on the cover. What broke me, what truly broke me, was not the insult. It was the ease with which it was delivered. Thomas didn't say burden like it hurt him to say it. He said it like he'd been saving the word, waiting for the right moment to fire it like a dart. It didn't sound like regret. It sounded like relief, like he'd finally said what he'd been thinking for years. And in that moment, I saw our entire history through a different lens. Not a montage of love and sacrifice, but a ledger of debts I'd paid with interest and never once asked to be repaid. A ledger he had conveniently forgotten the moment I became inconvenient. The night after that conversation, I sat in bed with Maria's old recipe book in my lap and a legal pad on the nightstand. I started listing everything I had done for him. Everything: tuition, rent, groceries, home repairs, emergency room copays, insurance premiums. The total made my chest tighten. Over $280,000 in direct financial support, not counting emotional labor, birthdays remembered, funerals attended, and long nights holding him through breakups, job losses, identity crises. I added a note at the bottom, and in return, one dinner, one sentence, one exile. The next morning, I stood at the front window and watched Frank deliver the mail. He paused at the driveway like he always did and gave a little wave. I waved back. He walked up and handed me the envelopes. "Cold one today," he said, blowing into his hands. "They say we're getting snow next week." "That right," I said, smiling despite myself. He nodded. "You know, if you ever need help shoveling, I live just around the block. My boys can come over. They owe me enough favors." I thanked him and he walked off. Didn't ask for anything. Didn't say it with pity. just offered, plain and true. And that's when I knew. That man, the one who had no obligation to me at all, had treated me with more respect and kindness than my own flesh and blood. Later that day, I wrote a note and placed it in the safe next to the will I would soon be rewriting. Frank, it said, in a world full of people who pretend you never did, thank you for seeing me, for being kind when you didn't have to be, for treating me like I mattered. This is yours now, not because you earned it, but because you didn't expect it. I folded the note and stared at it a long time, because that was the real lesson. You can give your heart to someone your entire life, and they'll toss it aside the moment it becomes heavy. But sometimes the people who don't ask for anything are the ones most deserving of everything. There's a particular silence that follows betrayal. It isn't immediate. At first, it's just a faint buzz in your ears, like the world's gone slightly out of tune. Then it stretches, it grows. It seeps into your bones until you start to realize the person you've loved for decades doesn't actually know you anymore. Or worse, they do, and they just don't care. That's the silence I lived in the week after Thomas told me I was a burden. I went through the motions, as always. Folded their towels, trimmed the hedges, even cleaned out the junk drawer in the kitchen. Julia smiled at me once, thin, rehearsed, the kind of smile you give to a coworker you secretly can't stand. Thomas barely spoke unless it was about bills or errands. I was a shadow in my own life, floating from room to room, wondering how I ever let it come to this. But in that silence, something stirred, not sadness, not self-pity. A fire. It started low, behind my ribs, and each time I caught them whispering behind closed doors or watched Thomas scroll through Facebook while I scrubbed his bathroom sink, that fire grew hotter. And then one morning, I stopped waiting for them to see me again. I decided it was time for them to feel me. It started with the will. I didn't rush it. Revenge, real revenge, is never rushed. I made an appointment with my lawyer, an old friend named Harold, who'd been with me since before Thomas was born. We sat across from each other in his office, him in his usual beige blazer, me clutching the old will like a patient bringing in an x-ray. "Everything okay, Dennis?" he asked, flipping through the paperwork. "Thomas still set to inherit everything?" I smiled, not wide, just enough to make him pause. "I'm making a few changes," I said, effective immediately. He raised an eyebrow, then nodded slowly. "You sure?" "More sure than I've ever been about anything," I said. We spent the next 2 hours drafting the new document. The house, my savings, the pension, my stocks, my 1967 Mustang in the storage unit 2 towns over. All of it, every dollar, every brick, every cent of my sweat was transferred into a trust. The beneficiary? Franklin Edward Monroe, mail carrier, zip code 85411. When Harold reached the relationship to client field and asked what to put, I said one word: friend. I walked out of that office lighter than I'd felt in years. It wasn't just about punishing Thomas. It was about setting myself free, about reclaiming my story. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't just someone's father. I was a man again. But I didn't stop there. No, revenge, true, soul-deep revenge, requires poetry. It requires timing. So I started preparing my exit, slowly, quietly. I waited until Julia was at her yoga retreat in Sedona and Thomas was working late shifts to make up for the car repair they blamed on bad luck. I packed up my room bit by bit, a sweater here, a book there, my old shaving kit. I donated most of my clothes, keeping only what I needed. I left the family photo albums. They'd never looked at them anyway. Then I started staging my goodbye. I mowed the lawn one last time, cleaned the gutters, fixed the squeaky hinge on the guest bathroom door. Even though no one thanked me the first time I fixed it 5 years ago, I wanted everything perfect. I wanted them to come home one day and find it all spotless and empty, like a ghost had passed through and taken the light with him. And then there was the letter. I spent a full evening crafting it. 3 pages, handwritten, left on the kitchen island where Julia liked to place her pressed juice and passive-aggressive sticky notes. I told them I was leaving, that I had found a better place, a quieter place, that I didn't need thanks or recognition or even acknowledgement, that I had given them everything I had, time, money, patience, dignity, and they had returned it with silence and sighs and the word burden. I didn't tell them where I was going. I didn't give them a number, but I ended the letter with one final line. Don't bother looking for the will. It's been updated, and it's not in your favor. I left early on a Saturday morning. The sun hadn't come up yet. I placed my key on the table beside the letter, took one last look around the house I'd built into a home, and walked out the front door without a sound. I didn't even close it hard, let them find it ajar, let the breeze carry the truth in behind me. I moved into a small rental house on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, just 2 rooms and a screened porch that overlooked a wooded creek. Peaceful. The kind of place you go to become a person again. Frank stopped by the first day with the mail. He looked surprised to see me. Well, well, he said, glancing at the forwarding address slip. Didn't think I'd find you here. I offered him coffee, and we sat on the porch like 2 old war buddies, sharing secrets we never planned to tell anyone. I didn't tell him yet what I had done. Not fully. That came later. But I did ask how his boys were, if he'd ever thought of owning a house. He laughed. Sure, he said, in a different life. Maybe when I win the lottery. I smiled and nodded, holding the knowledge in my chest like a warm coal. Well, I said, sometimes the lottery isn't something you buy a ticket for. Over the next few weeks, I started living for myself again. I read books I hadn't touched in years, cooked meals that only I liked, woke up when I felt like it. I even went to a community center event and played chess with a retired firefighter named Lewis. He beat me 3 games in a row, but didn't gloat. Just patted my shoulder and said, "You've got good instincts. You just trust too long." I knew what he meant. Then, one afternoon, the silence broke. My phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I knew the tone. Julia's voice came in sharp and fast, panic hiding behind performance. "Dennis," she said, like she hadn't ignored me for years, we need to talk. Thomas went to the lawyer. He said the will's been changed, that you disinherited him." I didn't speak, just let her fill the space with gasps and justifications. "He didn't mean what he said, about the burden thing. He was stressed. We were going through a rough time. We thought maybe you just needed guidance, that's all." Guidance, like I was a child. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady. "Julia," I said, "I cooked your meals, cleaned your floors, bought your furniture, paid your bills. And for that, I was told to get out." "Dennis, please," she said, "think about Thomas, about your legacy." "I did," I replied, "and I left it to someone who treated me like a human being." I hung up. That night I made a pot of chili, sat on the porch with Frank, who had just finished his route. I poured us each a bowl, handed him a beer, and pulled out the updated will. "Open it," I said. He blinked. "What's this?" "Your retirement plan," I said. He opened it slowly, scanning the page, his eyes widening with each line. I I can't accept this," he whispered. "I was just doing my job." "No," I said, "you were being decent, and these days that's more valuable than blood." He didn't cry, but he sat with me in silence for a long while, the 2 of us watching the creek run through the woods like it had somewhere better to be. And maybe that was the point. Maybe revenge isn't about hurting someone back. Maybe it's about putting value where it belongs, about saying, "I see you. You matter. And no, I won't give what's left of me to people who only knew how to take." The moment the will was read wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic in the Hollywood sense. No one threw a glass or stormed out. Instead, it was quiet, hollow, like the oxygen had been sucked out of the room and replaced with disbelief. And that silence, that stunned, empty silence, it was better than any applause I've ever heard. But before we get to that moment, let me tell you how we got there. 2 weeks after Julia's frantic call, Thomas reached out, first with a message, short, tense, clipped. "We need to talk." I didn't respond. Then another, "This is serious, Dad. Call me." Still, I said nothing. And then one morning I received an envelope. No return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Inside was a letter, handwritten by Thomas. The first I received in years. He apologized, not directly, not sincerely, just vague, generic statements like, "I realize I may have been harsh, and we've all said things we didn't mean." Then he got to the point. "I understand you've made some changes to your estate plan," he wrote, as if it were just a clerical error, not a deliberate strike to the core of his entitlement. "I'd really appreciate the chance to sit down and clear the air. We're family, after all." Family, he remembered that word now. I didn't write back. Instead, I called Harold, my lawyer, and told him to prepare for a formal reading. "You want it official?" he asked. "Oh, yes," I said. "Invite them. Send a courier. Make it formal. I want them sitting in your office with a pitcher of water and tissues on the table." "You expecting tears?" he asked. "Maybe," I said, "but not the kind that get sympathy." The meeting was scheduled for the following Friday at 10 a.m. I arrived early, of course. I always do. Harold had laid out the documents on a dark wood table, neatly stacked with paperweights and extra pens. I brought one thing, a photo. It was of me and Maria on our 35th anniversary. Her eyes still sparkled even then. I placed it on the table beside the will, a reminder of who I'd done all this for, who I was before Thomas and Julia turned me into a problem to be solved. At 10:02 they arrived. Thomas in a stiff blazer he clearly hadn't worn in months, jaw tight, eyes darting. Julia wore sunglasses indoors and carried herself like someone attending a deposition she was planning to contest. "Dad," Thomas said, nodding once. "Dennis," Julia added, offering a thin-lipped smile. "Good of you to invite us." "It was Harold's idea," I said, taking my seat, "but I thought it was appropriate." "To clear up the misunderstanding," Thomas said quickly, "because I think—" Harold raised a hand. "Let's get started." And just like that, the room went still. Harold read the preamble of the will, then launched into the distribution of assets. Their faces shifted immediately. "To Franklin Edward Monroe," he began, "I leave the entirety of my estate, including but not limited to the house at 117 East Willow Drive, all financial assets, retirement funds, personal belongings, and any liquid assets held in trust." I watched them try to parse the name. Julia blinked. Thomas tilted his head. "Who?" he asked. Harold continued without looking up. "Frank Monroe has served as a consistent presence in my life, treating me with dignity, respect, and humanity during a time when others failed to do so." "Wait, who is Frank?" Julia snapped. "The mailman," I said. "You know, the one who always waved, the one you made fun of for wearing shorts in November?" Her mouth fell open, then closed, then opened again. "You gave everything to the mailman?" "I gave everything," I said calmly, "to someone who never treated me like he was doing me a favor by acknowledging my existence." Thomas leaned forward, voice rising. "Dad, come on, this is ridiculous. You're angry. You're trying to make a point, but you can't be serious." "I'm not angry," I said, "not anymore." "This isn't just about us," Julia said quickly. "You're jeopardizing your legacy. Do you really want to be remembered as the man who gave his son's birthright to a stranger?" "Funny," I said. "I thought I was going to be remembered as the man you kicked out of his own home." Thomas's face turned a shade of red I hadn't seen since he was 16 and caught lying about a party. "I didn't mean that burden comment," he hissed. "It came out wrong." I was stressed. "You meant it," I said, "and it wasn't the first time you'd thought it. It was just the first time you said it out loud." He slumped back in his chair. Julia crossed her arms. Harold, unbothered, flipped the page. "To my son, Thomas Gregory Reeves," he read. "I leave a letter." He handed over the envelope I'd prepared. Thomas looked at it like it was ticking. "You're joking," he said. "A letter? That's what I get?" I shrugged. "It's more than you left me with." He ripped it open, read the first few lines, and then slammed it back on the table. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "All this because of a stupid argument?" "No," I said. "All this because I spent 40 years giving everything to someone who thought love was a transaction, and when the return on investment dried up, you tried to evict me like a squatter." "You're my father," he snapped. "Exactly," I said. "And you were my son. But then you became a landlord with a guilt complex." Julia stood abruptly. "This is outrageous. We're going to contest this." "You're welcome to try," Harold said, gesturing to the signed and notarized document. "But I wouldn't advise it. The paper trail is thorough. The mental competency tests are documented, and the client's intent is clear." "So that's it?" Thomas said, voice cracking. "You're cutting me out of your life for good?" "You did that part yourself," I said. They left in silence. No dramatic exits. No door slamming. Just the quiet footsteps of two people who finally realized they weren't the center of someone else's universe. After they left, I stayed a while. Harold poured me a glass of water, and we sat for a bit without talking. Then he looked at me and asked, "Do you feel better?" I thought about it, really thought. "Not better," I said, "but right. I feel like I finally stood up for the man I used to be." He nodded. "Then it was worth it." That night I walked to the mailbox at my new place and saw Frank's truck idling at the corner. I waved him down. He hopped out with a few letters and a puzzled look. "Heard there was a lawyer meeting today," he said. "Saw your boy stomping down the street like someone stole his lunch." "Something like that," I said. I handed him a copy of the will. His hand shook a little. "You're serious?" he whispered. "You really did it?" I nodded. "You didn't ask for this," I said. "You earned it." He didn't say anything, just looked at me like I was the last decent thing he'd ever seen. "You sure about this?" "As sure as I've ever been." He looked down at the papers again, then folded them carefully and placed them in his satchel like they were something sacred. "Thank you," he said, "for trusting me." "Thank you," I replied, "for reminding me what it feels like to matter." It's strange, the peace that follows a storm. You expect the world to look different. You think there'll be fireworks or catharsis or something cinematic like the final swell in a movie score. But when the dust settles, it's quiet, unremarkable. And in that quiet, you finally understand what freedom really feels like. It's not loud. It's not triumphant. It's the absence of weight, the moment when you stop carrying people who never once offered to carry you. That's what it felt like after the will was read and the door was closed on my former life. Not revenge, not justice, just space to breathe. For the first time in decades, I woke up with no obligations, no sideways glances across the breakfast table, no passive-aggressive comments from Julia about early retirees, no guilt humming beneath every chore I did without being asked. I woke up to silence, to sunlight through the blinds, to the sound of birds instead of complaints, and I knew I had done the right thing. Thomas didn't call after that, not once. Julia sent an email a week later, something cold and professional about how they were disappointed and confused, and that they hoped in time I would reconsider. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. Their disappointment wasn't mine to fix. Their confusion wasn't a mystery. I'd made my reasons painfully clear. And as for reconsidering, no. I had reconsidered my entire life the night I reread Maria's handwriting and remembered who I was before I started asking for scraps of kindness from people I raised. Some part of me still hoped Thomas might come around. Not for the money, not for the house, but for the relationship, a real apology, a moment of truth, something human. But it never came, and eventually I stopped waiting for it. Instead, I filled my days with things that mattered. I started going to the library again, read the kinds of books I used to fall asleep reading next to Maria. I joined a local senior chess group, not because I was good, but because I liked the sound of laughter bouncing off old wood tables. I fixed up the porch swing behind the rental and spent hours just watching the creek. Some evenings Frank would come by. We rarely talked about the inheritance. That part was already understood. We talked about music, old movies, how his youngest wanted to join the Navy. He offered to take me to lunch one Sunday and insisted on paying. When the check came, he said, "Just because you gave me something doesn't mean you owe me anything." I smiled. Same goes for me. It became a quiet ritual between us, not a father-son thing, not a repayment, just two men who understood the value of being seen. A few months later, I got a letter. Real envelope, real handwriting. Not Julia's this time, Thomas's. For a second, my heart jumped. Maybe it was time. Maybe he'd finally understood. Maybe he was ready to talk like a son who missed his father. But as I opened it and unfolded the pages, the hope faded line by line. It wasn't an apology. It was a negotiation. He spoke of closure, of compromise. He said he was willing to forgive and move on, as if I were the one who had hurt him. He asked me to reconsider a partial amendment to the will, said it didn't have to be everything, just enough to show that I still cared. I folded the letter, placed it in the drawer beside my bed, and left it there. Not out of anger, just finality. Because that letter didn't come from a son missing his father. It came from a man realizing he'd lost his safety net. I wish I could say I didn't grieve him, that I wiped my hands clean and never looked back. But that would be a lie. The grief came in strange waves, quiet, undramatic, like a ghost walking through my ribs when I least expected it. I missed him. Not the man he had become, but the boy he used to be. The kid who climbed into my lap during thunderstorms. The teenager who stayed up late helping me fix the car. The young man who cried when I gave him Maria's necklace to propose to Julia. I missed that version of Thomas, and maybe I always would. But I came to understand something important. Loving someone doesn't require keeping them close. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to let go of the people who no longer see you. Eventually, Frank came by with news. The legal process was done. The house was his. The deed had transferred. He'd already hired contractors to patch up the basement and fix the gutters I never could. "I was thinking," he said, kicking at the porch rail, "maybe we could turn it into something. Not just a house, maybe a shelter or a community center." I smiled. That place was always meant to be shared. "Would you come help?" he asked me. "You know it better than anyone." And I said yes, because sometimes the family you choose is better than the family you're born into. It wasn't long before I was helping design the new space, sketching blueprints, painting walls, even building benches out of old wood from the garage I once stood in, rewriting my future. Kids started showing up to the Saturday workshops we held. Seniors came for the garden club. There was music, conversation, joy, the kind of noise that heals something quiet in your soul. One afternoon, a woman asked if I had any children. I hesitated, thought about lying, but then I said, "I had a son once. We lost each other." She nodded slowly, no judgment, just understanding. "Well," she said, "you seem like the kind of man who deserves to be found again." And somehow I think I already had been. Months passed, then a year, and the strangest thing happened. I didn't feel old anymore. I felt full, like I had just enough of me left to give to the people who appreciated it. Not because they needed something, not because they felt obligated, but because they wanted me there. That was the revenge, not the will, not the trust fund, not even the look on Thomas's face when he realized the mailman got his inheritance. The real revenge was this. I stopped begging to be loved by people who measured my worth by how useful I was to them. I stopped shrinking to fit into a version of myself they could tolerate. And in doing so, I became more than a father. I became myself again. And now, I sit on the porch some evenings and think of Maria. I tell her everything about the house, about Frank, about the chess tournaments I always lose but still enjoy. I tell her how her words saved me, how her note in that lockbox reminded me of my own value. I tell her I'm okay, more than okay. I'm finally at peace. Sometimes I imagine her sitting across from me, hands wrapped around a cup of tea, nodding with that little smile that meant I knew you'd get here eventually. And I think if she were here, she'd be proud. Thomas and Julia still live in the same neighborhood. From what I hear, the property taxes have gone up. The mortgage is tight. They started a side business, something in home decor. I don't keep track. I don't need to. I've moved on. I don't tell this story to shame them. I tell it to remind you, and maybe myself, that being a parent doesn't mean being a doormat, that love is not licensed, that aging doesn't make you worthless, that kindness can come from anywhere, even the man who brings your mail in the snow with a smile. And sometimes the greatest act of love you can give is walking away.